Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the best on BC politics. It's been another interesting week across the political spectrum, including in Ottawa, where we've had a lot of developments resulting from that Freedom Trucker convoy that has rolled in front of Parliament City. So we're going to start there, and let me bring in the original pod squad, the panel here. Jillian, Katy, Maclean are all here this week to delve into the issues. We're also going to touch on the latest in the BC Liberal Party leadership race. First, let's start with Conservative leader Erin O'Toole, who's defeated in a non-confidence vote in his caucus this week after that arrival of the trucker convoy in Ottawa exposed some fault lines in the party. Some Conservative MPs were out there greeting protesters and getting stuck in pictures of protesters who had Confederate flags. There was a swastika at one point. O'Toole did not do that, which built upon a number of other festering issues left over from the last federal election. So let's go around and just get thoughts on what happened, and then we'll segue into a kind of a larger discussion about what this movement might mean for governments like the BC provincial government. Katy, what do we take away from the Erin O'Toole defeat?
Yeah, so we know that there's been some discontent brewing in the Conservative ranks for some time now, basically since the election. I do think that the truckers' protest at the anti-vax convoy did kind of spur the decision to remove Mr. O'Toole along, as well as the post-election debrief by James Cumming. It was a very decisive vote in caucus. He is now removed. The Conservatives will be going into a leadership race shortly. But I just want to say, Erin O'Toole posted one of the classiest farewell videos I think I've ever seen from a politician. And in that, he thanked Canadians, he thanked Conservatives, and he made an ironclad commitment to support the next leader, because that's what leaders and team players do. They put the collective over their own selfish interests. Hint, hint, BC Liberal leadership candidates.
Right, and we'll get to that because there's been a couple candidates who have basically kind of said they don't want to be part of this party anymore, the BC Liberal Party, if things don't go their way. We'll pick that up later in the podcast and in the show. Jillian, what do you make of what's happened to Erin O'Toole and kind of the dynamic that's occurring there in the Conservative Party?
I think that O'Toole was obviously not able to balance all of the different parts of his coalition, and that's why we saw such a decisive vote to get him out of there. I actually think that it is a bet for him to say that he's going to support the leader of the next Conservatives, no matter who they are, because he doesn't know who that's going to be. What if it's somebody that did appear in a photo with protesters who were holding, swastikas on the Canadian flag or Confederate flags, those kinds of things. I think the Conservative Party has a lot of hard questions to ask themselves about who they're going to be, because I think that we're seeing increasingly that mainstream voters are finding, elements of their coalition that are socially conservative, that are populist and extremist, so distasteful that it turns them off the brand altogether. And that's why we see the other parties like the BC NDP and the federal Liberals use that part of the coalition so effectively in their favor in elections when they do all that negative campaigning, even when you have a leader like O'Toole who campaigned on a very different vision.
Yeah, the party could go far right extreme. We don't know. The breadth of the leadership candidates could be all over the place. Maclean, what do you think?
Can I jump in on populism, Rob?
Sure, yeah, jump in.
Yeah, so I do want to take a moment and talk about what populism is, because I do think that it gets a bad rap. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing proposition. There are legitimate grievances with elite consensus, let's say. And so I think it is a good thing that Conservatives are champions for working class people. Where it gets concerning is when the people calling themselves populists veer into dogma, extremism, and hate. And to give you an example or a comparison, I guess, Harper's term in government was one of principled populism, whereas the PPC is something that I would classify as extremist dogma. So I think that, and also, you know what, Premier Horgan is a populist. If you look at their 2017 election platform, that was absolute populism, and it was a fairly spectacular contrast to our BC Liberal one. So I think just in terms of terminology, we want to be careful what value we assign specific words.
Yeah, sure. That's a great point. Maclean, jump in.
I think the Conservatives, it's vitally important for them to get pick the next leader and pick the right one, because the last thing they need, and any party needs, is to become a party where They pick a leader, they go into an election, they lose because sometimes you need 2 elections to introduce yourself to voters, and they decide that this person's a disaster, and the cycle repeats forever and ever and ever. And the party just sort of slowly loses credibility, or just gets that stench of losing on them, and it's hard to wash off. So now this is now 2 one-and-done leaders for the federal Conservatives. I have no idea who even the main contenders will be for this, but my advice to the Conservative Party is whoever they pick, unless it's a disaster, give them time, because this is not working.
Yeah, it's a very modern political phenomenon to just oust your leader the moment you lose the first attempt, and then that's it. Rebrand the whole party and go off in a different direction. So you're right, maybe some stability would help there. Okay, this is where it gets interesting. Let's kind of put this all together. You've got people in and around these anti-vax mandate protests. Some of them are total nut jobs, but it seems to have tapped into a larger frustration people are feeling on the fatigue of COVID, wanting to drop the restrictions to get back to normal. There's 2 interesting Angus Reid polls on this in the last week. One shows 54% of people want restrictions dropped and for the vulnerable to self-isolate. The other shows the majority of people feel government doesn't care about the issues that are important to them. And I think both illustrate that rising sense of anger and resentment. So, on the one hand, you have this extreme trucker protest in Ottawa, a blockade of the U.S. border in Alberta. The majority of people maybe are turned off by the elements of racism or hatred or anti-Semitism they find in parts of those. But on the other hand, you've got polling showing that a majority are actually feeling a kind of core frustration that might feed into the elements behind some of those protests. You see Saskatchewan moving earlier now and lifting its public health restrictions, as well as Alberta. What does the BC government do with this pressure, if anything, at a time when there's also high hospitalizations and ICUs? How do you think the government here has to reconcile all of that? Maclean, let's start with you there.
It's a very difficult tightrope to walk, not just for the government, for your average person expressing opinions on Twitter, when an opinion you share in a general way is being expressed more loudly and much more hatefully by extremists. And it's not limited to things like vaccine mandates. You can pick any hot button issue that you may or may not see protests on, and you'll see people who may broadly agree with the sentiment, but oh my God, please stop talking about it because now I can't. And that's kind of the situation the government's in. The polls do indicate that there is a broad and increasingly larger consensus of people who are rapidly looking forward to the end of things like vaccine passports and mandates in general. And that's something the government has to be aware of and reckon with. But it gets really hard because they cannot allow themselves to be perceived to be being pushed around by, angry people waving signs or parking their trucks and blocking residential streets. So it's tough. You have to articulate very clearly and calmly the reasons why policies change and hope that people sort of take that in good faith and don't think that you're just being held hostage by a bunch of angry people.
Yeah, you don't want the extremists to become emboldened by actions and blockades and things that they think are getting governments to change, even though the undercurrent of frustration that might exist in the population is pushing governments to that change anyways. Jillian, how do you think a government like BC has to reconcile all those kind of moving forces?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, the government has been sensing that people have been exhausted by the restrictions for some time. And that's why they were so reluctant during the Omicron wave before the holidays to put in restrictions. We saw them kind of, put in a few and then put in a few more like 4 days later when they realized that they really, really had to. And I think they've been on that path for a while. I think that there is a distinction between broad restrictions that affect everyone, like, restrictions on gatherings and events, closures of bars and fitness centers, and the vaccine cards. I think, and Dr. Henry indicated this week, that, even though we're probably likely to see some of those broad restrictions lift, because 93% of adults in BC are vaccinated, the vast majority of people. I think we're going to see those stay for a while. That was the Premier's response when he was asked about the convoy. He said, my focus is on the 90% of people who are vaccinated, the 80-90% of truckers who are vaccinated. So I think that you'll continue to see them keep that aspect of the restrictions as long as they can to, both for the public safety measures and also for public confidence that they're continuing to manage the pandemic responsibly. But I think that, they've been feeling the pressure on the rest for a while.
Yeah. Katy, the timeline that Dr. Henry sort of set out here, revisiting some restrictions on Family Day, which is kind of mid to late February, and then some more by spring break. Does that hold, do you think, with the public pressure when Alberta, Saskatchewan, and others are kind of moving more quickly? Does BC, do you think, feel that pressure in any way, or what would you think that the government needs to do here?
I think BC is in a more politically advantageous place than Alberta or Saskatchewan. Yes, we have 52% of folks compared to 44% who want the restrictions lifted versus who want them to stay, which is a slightly lower number than in Alberta and in Saskatchewan. But the political pressure, the polarization in Alberta is unmatched in this province. And here especially, I have always gotten the impression that Dr. Henry was only imposing restrictions as a last resort. I don't think she takes delight in these public health orders. In fact, she said publicly as such. So I think, and also by and large, BC has done a good job at minimizing restrictions compared to other jurisdictions. So I don't think that the same political pressure and public outcry exists here. I think that they have provided a reasonable time frame, and I think that BC will want to move relatively in sync with Western Canada, but by and large, I don't think that we are going to have, rallies in the streets compared to what you may see in Alberta and to a lesser extent, Saskatchewan.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that take. I think, and especially, Dr. Henry and Adrian Dix have shown themselves fairly good at resisting public pressure, sometimes for good, sometimes for not, on change. And if they want to hold on based on the hospitalizations and ICU cases, which are quite high in BC right now, I think there's still a little bit of public appetite left to hold on a little bit longer, as long as there's a timeline in front of people that, Family Day and spring break are times where things get revisited as well. So we'll see how that pressure goes. I find it fascinating to watch. And actually, I tweeted out an article that Jillian shared with the group, but it's on my Twitter feed if you want to look, about the interesting dynamics of how the far left kind of fringe and the far right fringe, so the extremes of the Green and kind of PPC movements, are able to coalesce behind some of these protests and kind of the dynamics that are at play there. I'd recommend you read it if you have a minute, which kind of illustrates some of the things that we're talking about here as well. Let's move on to what I think, I would say this is not the final conversation about the BC Liberal leadership race, but depending on when you listen to this, we're recording on Friday. The race results should be revealed on Saturday night, so keep that in mind when you're listening. But what do we finally call the BC Liberal leadership race as it reaches the end here? I'm going to go with almost a disaster. I think it went on way too long. It's not produced the renewal that the party had hoped for. We're in the final week. There are allegations of voter irregularities. There's fake text messages with fake PIN numbers floating around, suppressing people's vote. We have a court challenge to delay the leadership vote. We have candidate Val Litwin publicly saying he'll quit the party if Kevin Falcon wins. Basically, kind of that move, you play a board game with someone and it goes really wrong and they're a sore loser and they knock it over and they take off. He's going to pull that move. You've got Katy Merrifield saying she lacked confidence in the party's voting process and that evil may in fact win. I don't know what she's talking about, but and then you have suggestions of all sorts of second and third party votes, choices that need to be made to kind of handle this preferential ballot, multiple voting system, round, complicated, advanced math is required to understand voting system. So regardless of who wins, and you may know who has won by the time you listen to this, what has this race done to the BC Liberal Party in terms of what it was hoping it was actually going to do? Katy, let's start with you there.
Yeah, so first and foremost, leadership races are always contentious in every political party across the spectrum. That's not new. However, with this one, I have always been concerned that it was too long. When races are long, tempers have a tendency to flare. There are more attacks between candidates lobbed on each other because people get burnt out, exhausted, and among other negative attributes. So I've always been concerned that this is a bit too lengthy and that what we've seen in this race, it wasn't really a leadership race that was based on substantive policy. It was more, it's more famous now for the attacks that candidates have lobbed on each other. And when you have a coalition, big tent party like the BC Liberals, divisions and fractures is pretty much a recipe for disaster. So I remain hopeful, though. Should the vote proceed, should the court case fail, which it looks like it will, thankfully, the leader has a lot of work ahead of them in terms of healing those wounds, building fences, whatever metaphor you want to use. It's a tall order to ensure that this coalition stays together.
But what do you think of Val Litwin in particular saying he's going to quit the party if he doesn't win, basically? And I just want to ask that because I sense this kind of difference. You ran the successful leadership campaign in the last BC Liberal race, but I sense this time around there's a little bit less party unity, a little bit less people willing to kind of stick around afterwards and make this thing work. Maybe it's because the Liberals appear to be in the position they're in, which is so far behind. But what do you make of candidates just saying, if I don't win, I'm just going to burn this place down on my way out?
I was livid when I saw that, and I was really disappointed. I have helped all of the leadership candidates in one way or another, minus one, I think. And Val is exactly the type of person that the BC Liberal Party needs. And so when he resorted to what I would deem a very childish tactic like that, a couple things sprung to mind. First of all, why? If you've worked in politics, politics is a team sport, always. That's how we get elected. That's how we win elections. It's incredibly important that everyone stay together. And then secondly, what strategic value does this have? I've had several BC Liberals in the last 24 hours say that Val was going to be their number one, and now they're not voting for him. And these are longtime members of the party. And so I guess the play is to try and rally a bunch of anti-Kevin votes to him, but anyone that has been involved with or respects the political process, they value team players, and he just proved that he isn't one.
Yeah. Jillian, you've run leadership campaigns. What do you make both of, I guess, where the party is at the end of this compared to where it wants to be, and also some of the conduct of kind of candidates at the last minute?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're seeing, thinking about what's happening with the BC Liberals and the Conservatives, there are a lot of parallels, right? They were both in government for many years. During the Clark and the Harper years, it felt like all they did was win. But now they've been shit out for a couple of election cycles, and everybody's obviously really concerned about that. And all the candidates have different ideas of what went wrong and how to fix it. And I think that's the issue. They have not been able to come to a consensus through the leadership race. It's going to be really interesting to see if the results do show some kind of consensus or if it's very close and divided. If you asked me a couple weeks ago if I thought that the party was at risk of splintering, I would have said no, because I think the Liberals have been very conscientious about how troubling that would be for their electoral chances in the future. But it certainly does. I don't know what's going on with Val Litwin's campaign, but it certainly seems like he might be hedging that there might be another party emerging if Falcon becomes leader, because I can't think of another reason why he would do this, to Katy's point.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the past, everyone has stood on a stage together at the end of a leadership vote and celebrated in the form of showing some type of unity. But I'm not getting the impression that may happen this time around, which I think is a bad sign for the party in general and the larger thing. Maclean, what do you make of all this?
It's unfortunate. You mentioned the shot at the end where all the candidates are on stage together. That costs nothing for all those concerned, no matter how they feel. You're being asked to be gracious for 5 minutes. It really shouldn't be too much to ask. You're going to have to stand next to politicians you disagree with even more in the very near future if you win. So get used to it. The other thing is it's with Val, I think he's put himself in a very difficult position. He's essentially said to the voters, some of whom have already voted for him, that he wants to lead the party, but he doesn't necessarily trust how they're going to vote on this, which is a difficult position to put yourself in. And he talks about, Kevin Falcon specifically, being a voice of the past and the party needs to renew. The NDP are led by John Horgan, and the two most senior cabinet ministers are Mike Farnworth and Adrian Dix, all of whom were significant political figures in the 1990s, and no one would argue that party did not successfully rebrand, renew, and reinvigorate itself over the past 5 years. These are just not criticisms levied at them. So it's hard to understand how Falcon's more recent experience is a hindrance. So this was not advice I would have given Val Litwin. I understand the frustration. I understand, walking into results that you're not going to win. And that's a hard thing to do, but I don't think he handled this very well.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with Maclean on the renewal piece. look at Kevin's campaign. Like, he should be evaluated not on like his age or what he represents, but the people that he attracts. Their campaign has every single BC Young Liberal youth club in the province behind them. Their team is extremely diverse in terms of age, gender, ethnicity. Like, this is a blueprint for what's to come if Kevin is successful. And so we should people should stop looking at him alone and look at what he brings to the table.
Okay, we put it all together and everything we've talked about over the last few weeks, and here we are on the eve, and people will be able to judge our predictions here in real time, basically. But let's go around and give the best shot at who you think is going to win this race. Jillian?
Well, I was going to pick Val Litwin before his tweet, but I think that Katy's right, and his threat to leave the party probably hurt him. So I'm going to say Michael Lee is going to pull it out.
Okay. Katy?
Kevin within the first 3 ballots, hopefully first or second, to send a really decisive message. And then I think Ellis is number 2. And I think Gavin Dew is really going to surprise people. I think he is going to get a clear 3rd place.
Wow, 3 choices there. Okay. All right. Maclean?
My top 3.
Just for the sake of being different, I think Kevin Falcon will be first on the first ballot and maybe the first couple ballots, but the favorites lose just as often as they win these things. And so I'll say Ellis Ross.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I was going to go with Kevin Falcon, but, you know, there is a possibility that he is the Peter MacKay of this leadership race, and things do not go well, or just the balloting system and the different ways in which this is done does not produce the result that he's looking for. So I guess you can fact check us in real time on that, but we will still be back next week with all the latest, including a look at who won and how. The legislative session is returning with a throne speech next week, so there's going to be a lot to discuss there as the government kind of lays out its agenda for this spring. It's going to be a very long session with a new budget and focused on all sorts of economic recovery things. We may actually be in the time of economic recovery at the end of this pandemic, maybe. So there'll be a lot to talk about. Stay with us. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast. We will be back next week for all the latest on Political Capital.